talk. So I believe I'm here to talk about deaf, or employment, I suppose, within Deaf Village, to give you a bit of a background. Is that correct? Yeah? That's what you want me to talk about? Is that right? Yeah? Some head nods would be good. Let me know what I'm talking about. Grant. Okay, so just to explain who I am, my name is Mary, and I work for an organisation called the Catholic Institute for Deaf People. So our headquarters are based here in Deaf Village, Ireland, and we run the boarding school. So it's a bit complicated. It's the Holy Family School for the Deaf, and we run the boarding campus, so where the boys and girls kind of come up to stay, but we don't run the schools. So it's a bit kind of confusing. And then we have St. Joseph's House for deaf and deaf-blind adults, which is in Stillorgan, over the south side of the city. So basically what we're doing there at the moment is we've got it's a home, it's an institutional type setting, you know, it's a nice house, but we're transitioning into the community. So people who've lived there for 40, 50 years are now moving back into the community. So we're going through a massive change there, and we're just in the middle of a huge recruitment drive at the moment. So in terms of the employment within Deaf Village, I can't really speak to that too much because we're all individual organisations who make up the Deaf Village campus. But there was, I suppose, around 2014, I think there was a bit of controversy around employment, because what you had was a lot of the deaf organisations here, and there had been about 5 jobs that were advertised, and hearing people had got rid of those jobs, even though deaf people had applied. So there was kind of an outcry from the deaf community at the time. They kind of went like, this is Deaf Village and there should be employment opportunities for hearing people, for deaf people, but all these hearing people were getting jobs. So there was a massive meeting that was held in the hall just across the way. Would somebody mind shutting that door, because it's a bit noisy, isn't it? And this room is not great for sound. Sorry. Thank you. So there was about 300 deaf people from all over Ireland, you know, came to the meeting in the hub, and as a result of that then it was decided that we would have, at the time it was called affirmative action in terms of any recruitment policy. So each of the organisations made a commitment that, you know, their recruitment processes would be reviewed, and they would look at how do we employ or make the recruitment process more deaf friendly and more accessible for deaf people. So that was back in 2014, and at the time I was a PA to the CEO in CIDP, and I got into HR then in 2016. So obviously from 2016 then I had some input in terms of the recruitment policies in our organisation. So we're in a kind of a difficult situation because we're governed by a group called HIQA, it's HIQA, so the Health Information Quality Authority, and I think Ofcom is the equivalent in the UK maybe. So we're governed by them, and they've got very strict rules around, you know, who should be employed. So we've kind of had to be very creative with our recruitment processes. So in the last year, we have gone from having, for example, in our boarding, or in St. Joseph's House for deaf and deaf-blind adults, we've gone from having 8 deaf people to just recently, about 20 deaf working there. So we've really increased the focus on having deaf people, or people who are fluent in sign language, working with our residents and with our boarders. So we have, in the boarding campus, we've got 2 separate campuses, and one is for the boys and one is for the girls. And in the girls campus, we've always kind of had more deaf people, but in the boys campus we haven't had a deaf person work there for probably the last 6 years. So we really had to try and get a focus on getting a deaf person in there. And we recently had an internal advertisement and we got a deaf person in, and the difference it's made to the boys. Like they're talking so much more about things that are going on in their personal life. And it's not that the hearing staff are bad people or that the boys don't like them, but they're not deaf, so they don't get it. They don't get that deaf experience. And the hearing staff are actually starting to comment now and say things like, you know, we actually can't believe that such and such is. So we might have a couple of boys who come from difficult backgrounds and they would never have spoken about that before. But all of a sudden we have this deaf person and they're just opening up and they're starting to talk more, they're starting to relate. they're getting involved in more activities, and that's just from one deaf person. So, you know, you can imagine, like, for us, it's, I suppose, the frustration that we can't get more people, you know, that we can't get more deaf people into that service. So we're constantly looking at our recruitment processes. So what we've done is, in the boarding campus, we've said you need to have a minimum of level 7 social care, but then we've put or equivalent. So what we look for is, because I'm involved in the deaf community, I used to be an interpreter and my mum and dad are deaf, so I would know a few people, and I'm kind of looking to see, trying to use my network to say, well, what are people studying then? So what are deaf people when they leave school and they go to college? What are they studying? And they're studying things like youth work. You know, they're generally not going into social care. So we've looked at, well, you know, an equivalent level 7 in youth work is actually an acceptable qualification. Things like advocacy, or the Centre for Deaf Studies, you know, if there's deaf people who've studied there, or hearing people who are fluent in sign language, you know, is also another. So we're really starting to look at our service and our model and say, okay, this is a social care model, but actually that social care model is based and has been created by hearing people to suit hearing kids. And so we need to take that model and take aspects of that model and go, you know what, that's really good, but how do we then develop that further to make sure that we do what's right for the deaf kids that we have? And then for the residents in St. Joseph's House, it's not as hard, because the standard that's set by HICWA is lower. So it's a level 5 healthcare assistant course, and we've been really lucky because the Irish Deaf Society have just run through their education programme. They've just run a healthcare assistant course. So we have about 15 deaf people who are available to us to apply for jobs. So that's been just fantastic. So we've a huge recruitment drive going on at the moment. So we're encouraging, so we're looking at not just healthcare assistants, but we're looking at maybe deaf people who've studied in the Centre for Deaf Studies. And again, the advocacy thing is huge, because with residents moving into the community, you know, deaf people are, you know, we need deaf people to be role models for them, because, you know, normal deaf people live in the community, so why wouldn't you have a deaf person who's moving into the community have a deaf role model to show, well, actually, you know, when I need an interpreter, this is what I do, or if I go to the doctor, this is what I do. So it's been really, really good, and, you know, so far so good. You know, we're trying to really create that space. I mean, I know I talked about the social care model, but then we need to also develop that more. We're looking at things like deafhood, and we're starting to look now at communication policies, because what we found is, when we had a deaf person start in, for example, St. Joseph's boarding campus, some of the hearing staff weren't used to dealing with deaf adults. They've always, for years, worked with deaf children, and they were having a really hard time seeing deaf people as an equal, seeing them as a professional on the same level. So now that's kind of prompted us to look at hearing privilege, to look at communication policies, and look at ISL as being the first language of the organisation, not just the operational language. So we're exploring that whole piece now at the moment, so we're hoping to bring that then back to staff. So that's what we're doing anyways in organisation. I can't speak for other organisations, but I do know that there was a commitment made that any organisation that was advertising a job within Deaf Village, the recruitment panel would always have at least one deaf person, and we do that. We would always have a deaf person on our recruitment panels, because we like to see, well, first of all, if a deaf person's applying for a job, you know, that they have somebody who they can relate to, but also if hearing people are applying for a job, you know, that we see how they relate to deaf people, and that we see how they react initially to sign language, because that's a huge. Now, we let them know, obviously, that an interpreter is going to be there at their interview. We don't spring that on them or anything like that. But at the same time, if you're applying for a job here, you're going to be working with deaf people, so that's the requirement. So we like to see how people interact with the deaf person on the panel, and they give us great insight then to say, you know, like, there's been a couple of times where, even though I've grown up in the deaf community, I'm still not deaf. I still don't have that experience, and so I see, you know, I might relate or engage very well with somebody, and the deaf person will say, no, there was just something not right there, and we need to listen to that, because it's their experience. You know, they're the ones that deal with hearing people every day, like day in, day out. So that's our experience anyway. I don't know, does anyone have any questions or comments or?
Yeah. How many deaf people work in the head office and are helping to set up these recruitment policies?
So I'm the only HR person, so it's just me in terms of the recruitment policies. In head office, we've got Nicholas and Alan. So Nicholas and Alan are deaf, and then there's Mary, Jack and Keith, Nicholas, Alan, me. So the 6 and two of them are deaf. So because I'm the only HR person, I'm the one that's kind of looking, but I would engage a lot with the Irish Deaf Society and kind of look for best practice and ask, from a deaf perspective, what is the right thing to do, or what is the trend and stuff in terms of kind of deaf employment. But we definitely.
So there's 6 altogether?
There's 6, let me think, there's Declan, Mary, Keith, 3 and 2, so 5 based in the office over there. Yeah, in head office.
And they're all hearing?
No, 2 are deaf. 2 are deaf, yeah. So our social media and admin person is deaf, and one of our financial accountants are deaf. And that was really important for us because we don't just want tokenistic deaf people, we want deaf people at all levels of management within the organisation. So up until last year, we didn't, or maybe 2019, just up until 2017, we never had a deaf person on our senior management team. But we now have one, so our property and facilities manager is deaf. But our senior management team is made up of 9 people, so that's not a great balance of deaf and hearing. So we're looking at kind of like part of my role, we look at succession planning and how do we make sure that our recruitment processes are accessible to deaf people, and what kind of qualifications are we looking for, because we know that traditionally, well here in Ireland anyway, deaf people haven't been able to access the education system in the same way that hearing people can. That's just, I think, something that happens all over the world. So, what changes do we need to make it more accessible for deaf people to apply for jobs? So that's our senior management team. In our middle management team, we've got, across the organisation, we've got 9 team leaders, and 3 are deaf and 6 are hearing. So 3 are deaf and 6 are hearing. So again, it's an okay balance, but we would like.
Are 3 of the team leads hearing?
Yeah.
Yes.
No.
Sorry.
3 are deaf.
Sorry.
3 are deaf and 6 are hearing. Yeah. And so we're trying to, always look at ways of, in terms of succession planning, where do we even advertise? Like up to now, we've been advertising in Ireland, and one of the things that I was at a CODA workshop recently, and one of the presenters is from England, but was telling me about is it called Deaf for Deaf?
What was it you were on?
A CODA workshop, sorry. And it was the guy who was doing the presentation was saying that there's an organisation, or I don't know, is it just an email group called Deaf for Deaf, and I think they advertise jobs in the UK. So we have some people who've applied for jobs in the UK, but only because they've had Irish friends and they've heard about it. So as part of my recruitment process now, I'll be advertising any jobs on that network, because rather than just being focused in Ireland and going, okay, who's here? There's a whole network of professionals available to us, and hopefully with Brexit we'll get more that want to go and move to Ireland. And so that's what I'm kind of hoping. And we've a lot of Irish people who've had to go to the UK for jobs because they haven't had them here. They haven't never had the opportunity. So especially at senior level, any job opportunities, we're trying to reach out to deaf people to say, listen, there's a job opportunity now, come back, come back home, take the job, because it's very difficult. I think that lady had a question, I think she had her hand up before.
So just have a lot of questions, just thinking. You're saying about the website there, and you're going to start advertising jobs on it, and there's going to be a list. Will it be in English? So yeah, will there be advertising? Will there be an ISL video on it to advertise them, or will it be in English, or will it be on the website, or will it be for the deaf community now to go to there? Yes.
Yeah. Well, on our website, we advertise the jobs with ISL translation. So anytime I send out a job advertisement, we do it on we have a website here called ActiveLink, which is linked into the charity sector, and then Alan in head office translates but we always make sure that the English and the ISL go up at the same time. It's not that the English goes out and then the ISL is an afterthought, so it's always done at the same time. So that's on our website. That's on our website, yeah.
It's interesting. Just have another question. So whenever like the deaf are going to the UK, so before they work for the Deaf Association, yeah, so there's an organisation called Mayflower, and that was like the centre for it all. And deaf people were able to look at that to see like the qualification level as well, to see so they found that like the deaf people on that website, they do have the experience, they just don't have the actual qualifications on to show on like their CV.
Yeah, and then you're right, the opposite then, we have hearing people who come in with no sign language but would have the qualification. And so we need to make sure that we're like, I think before we really looked at our processes, the balance was always towards hearing people with the qualification. But actually we've got all these deaf people with amazing experience and they just don't have the qualification. And so, you know, we've had to make a commitment, and our board is very, you know, are good.
So I mean, if the hearings have the qualification, but they can sign, so if the hearing person has the qualification but they can't sign then, and I think what you're saying is that if a hearing person comes in, they've no sign, that you need to train them to their sign, and then when deaf come in, train them their qualifications. Yeah, that's exactly what we do. So we have so when hearing people come in, part of the criteria is that if you don't sign, you have to achieve level 4 within 2 years. And level 4?
So level 4 here. So we start at level 3. So the IDS provide classes, so you have level 3 and level 4, and they're the only qualifications you can get in Irish Sign Language here, unless you go to the Centre for Deaf Studies in Trinity. And so within 2 years you have to achieve level 4. But on the other side, that's what I was just going to say, that we looked at our recruitment processes and we said, you know, we are an organisation that's deaf, we provide services to deaf people, and so we need to have an opportunity. So when deaf people come into us with, say, for example, a level 5, then we have invested in a training programme so that they can come up to social care level, and whether that's level 5, level 6 or level 7. Once they're in the door, it's much easier for us to do that, and so that's what we do. We look at, and that's why we say now level 7 or equivalent, because if somebody has done an equivalent in, say, the Centre for Deaf Studies, they've got they're deaf, obviously, so they've got deaf culture, they've got deaf, you know, they've got ISL. And then what we can do is we can put them on a training programme so that they get the social care part of it. So that's what we do. Did you have a question?